Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
All right, namaskara and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Soumya Prabhakar, and today we are stepping outside the usual policy beat into the forest, quite literally. My guest today is Sanjay Gubbi. He is a conservation biologist and founder of Holematti Nature Foundation. With a master's degree in conservation biology and a PhD in leopard ecology and conservation, he focuses on large carnivores like tigers and leopards in Karnataka. Gubi works at the intersection of policy making, education, research, and fieldwork while engaging with diverse stakeholders, including the government and local communities. His recent books are The Last Pathway, Wildlife Corridors of Karnataka, and Leopard Diaries. Today, we are talking about the science of counting and coexisting with predators, how protected areas actually get expanded and monitored on the ground, and whose voices get heard in that process. Sanjay, welcome to All Things Policy podcast.
Namaskara, Soumya. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be part of your podcast, and I've heard a lot about Takshashila Institution and the work you people do. So I'm very happy to talk to this very wide variety of audience you people have.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and really appreciate the time you've taken out to be on this podcast. So we'll get started. So you've been doing this for 30 years now, and what's changed the most about, say, Indian wildlife conservation since then, and what's probably stayed stubbornly the same?
See, if you look at India's wildlife scenario from the day of independence, let's break it into three phases. From 1947, when India got independence, till 1972, the first phase, when the Wildlife Protection Act came into being. Then I would say from 1972 to mid 2000, like 2005, 2010, that's the second phase. And the last phase is to the post 2010. This is how I would break the three eras or call it as three eras of India's wildlife conservation.
Okay.
Between independence and 1972, any wildlife in this country could have been hunted without any permits. There was no legal bar on hunting elephants or tigers or leopards. In fact, people used to organize safaris, hunting safaris for tourists. Anyone could come into India, or Indians could hunt any wildlife. Even the government of India would organize hunting safaris for tourists from abroad to raise foreign exchange. But in 1972, the government brought in the Wildlife Protection Act, which stopped killing of wildlife without permit, except for in exceptional circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So that brought in a different scenario altogether and brought in protection for wildlife, not just for animals, but also the habitats they survive in. So there was areas designated as protected areas, which we call as national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and other protected areas. And under the policy and the law, as you rightly know, definitions were very important. So definitions were drawn under the Wildlife Protection Act. What is wildlife? What is habitat? What is a nest? What is an animal, wild animal? All these kinds of definitions were brought into various sections of the Wildlife Protection Act. So 72 onwards, things started to change. Till 72, the wildlife scenario was dipping. Several species were almost on the verge of extinction, including the India's national animal, the tiger. It was estimated we had less than 1,800 tigers in the country. But as soon as the Wildlife Protection Act came up, several species, including tiger, the Asiatic lion, the rhinoceros, the Asian one-horned rhinoceros, and several other species started to bounce back.
Okay.
And many new protected areas were notified. A new project called as the Project Tiger was brought in 1973 with an ecosystems approach where Tiger was the symbolic head of a project called Project Tiger, but it was looking at protecting ecosystems and landscapes. So that all these efforts brought back the decimating wildlife populations in the country. A lot of interest was also put in by civil societies. They supported the government. There were a lot of activists who were trying to get in their own ways of doing wildlife conservation. And it went very well. A lot of populations came back. Of course, it also led to human wildlife conflict. So till 2005, 2010, this was the story. There was a lot of interest by civil societies, individuals, etc. But as India's economy changed in the mid 2000s and late 2000s, there was a lot of interest that came into wildlife. So
Mm.
safaris increased. There was a keen interest in wildlife safaris. There was a keen interest in photography. Then came social media. Then the definition of wildlife conservation itself completely changed. People were not just interested in wildlife or protecting wildlife, they were interested beyond that, which was more for optics, in my opinion. There was
Mm.
a lot of interest in wildlife photography, doing tourism, especially for tiger safaris. But none of this actually, though the good intent was to plow it back to conservation, they remained as social media icons. They became social media tools.
Mm.
So that took wildlife conservation and interest in wildlife in a completely different direction. So these are my three definitions of how wildlife history in this country was.
Great. Thank you so much, Sanjay. I think a great primer for somebody who's not too familiar with how wildlife conservation looks like. So let's jump into the science or the population biology and the coexistence debate itself. So let's start with something people don't often think about, right? How do you actually count a tiger or a leopard population accurately? Like, I've been fascinated about the tiger census. I've never been part of it, but have had friends who signed up for something like this. So, what's still hard about that, even with, say, modern tools like camera traps and things like that?
It's a very interesting question you're asking, Soumya. And you also used a very naive term called census, tiger census. Unfortunately, census and estimations are completely different tools. Census is like a total count. With human beings, you can go from house to house and get a fairly accurate count of number of people in an area or in a city or in a country.
Right.
And when you do this total count, you use the term census.
Mm.
But in wildlife, due to various restrictions, both physical, geographical, and the behavior of the animal, we can't get a total count like we do with people. So what we do is we can estimate, fairly accurate estimates can be brought up using sampling methodologies. We can't go and count every tiger or every leopard in an area,
Mm.
but we can fairly estimate after we count a part of the population using statistical tools. You can come out with a fairly robust estimate. How can we do that? Different methodologies exist for different species. For naturally marked animals like tigers and leopards, or even for giraffes, or even for elephants, which have different forms of tusks, or there are very specific marks on their body, like a cut tail or a cut ear, which you can identify individuals using those kinds of marks.
Mm.
We can fairly, there are methodologies called as capture recaptures. So you use the capture recapture and then use statistical models and estimate their population. But if you want to estimate population of species which are, let's say, abundantly found and do not have natural markings on their body, like sambar, or even for that matter, elephant, or langur, or bonnet macaque, which cannot be individually identified, you use other methodologies. For example, called something called as distance sampling.
Okay.
So people use, you can these days, apart from using direct methodologies like camera trapping or seeing them directly, you
Mm.
can also use genetic tools. People use acoustic tools these days. Because you can identify individual animals from the calls they make.
Mm.
You can use the same capture recapture framework and count the number of animals. So different species and different groups of taxa have different methodologies to estimate.
Wonderful. Oh, acoustic tools is something that I've just not thought about. So it's so interesting to listen. That, of course, I'm sure in the territory that you work, it might be a common way of using this in the most scientific way. So thanks for that, Sanjay. So as a follow up, right? You've written a lot about counting the unmarked, estimating populations from the indirect data too, right? What does that method hold up up, and when should people be skeptical of the numbers they are given? Like sometimes there's this thought that runs in people's mind that, like you said, it's close to accuracy but not be like the perfect number, right? So how do you kind of communicate this to people? Like, say, I know this now because we are exchanging this conversation. So how do you actually let people know that this is the process, or it's close to accuracy and these are the various tools used for the same?
I would discount the opinion that they're not very accurate. They are actually fairly accurate. It may not be like I have 56 tigers. It may give you a range between 50 and 58 tigers, let's say,
Okay.
for
Okay.
example, which is fairly robust and accurate.
Mm.
And it's rooted and based on very strong biostatistics. So
Okay.
hence, it's a very good. I wouldn't discount it at all. It's a very good tool and it's published internationally. It's used for various species, and very importantly, all these are validated through peer-reviewed publications. So
Okay.
if you publish your results in peer-reviewed publications, I'm not talking about this journals which are, uh, you know, these predatory journal kind of things. Unfortunately, India's
Mm.
academics also publishes a lot in predatory journals.
Mm.
I'm not talking about those journals, but proper peer-reviewed journals. Once it's published, it's going to go through a peer review process, so it's validated. So it's very rigorous, actually. Recently, I was having a discussion with somebody who works on AI, and
Mm.
they said their publication process is not very rigorous. But in wildlife science, whatever I have seen is it's very, very rigorous. I'm trying to publish a paper on estimation of prey population from Kaveri and MM Hills. And the manuscript is going through so many revisions. It has almost taken me 1.5 years now. It's going to come out in the next 1 or 2 months. But
Mm.
that's the kind of rigor that is going through wildlife science.
Wonderful.
But you can't stop at scientific publication. If you want to give it to the larger society, largest stakeholders, you
Mm.
have to deduce it into forms where common people understand this, and you have to make it beyond the walls of paywall, like academic journals are beyond the paywalls.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we try to publish them in popular articles, as gray reports,
Mm.
also as books. We give a lot of talks. We do capacity building activities, not just for forest department, but also for enthusiasts who are interested in wildlife conservation.
Oh.
We go and give talks to a wide variety of stakeholders. And that is, according to me, our responsibility in ensuring that the outreach reaches a larger variety of stakeholders.
Okay, great. So let's move forward. So, can you help us unpack the distinction between what is coexistence and co occurrence, Sanjay?
In general, coexistence is thought or it's defined as something where both people and animals or wildlife, I'm very specific, wildlife,
Mm.
are living happily. There's no negative impact on either sides. But
Mm.
unfortunately, that's a very utopian thinking. Whenever there is a conflict prone species or a species which is going to impact human lives or human livelihoods or even create anxiety, there's always some amount of discomfort in people. And similarly, animals also face similar kind of pressures. So some species certainly will be a coexistence, like, for example, red-whiskered bulbul. They're found all over, even in Bangalore city or in Mumbai or in Delhi. So there's no negative impact on either side
Mm.
until and unless people go out and completely destroy habitats of red-whiskered bulbul or blue rock pigeon,
Mm.
then they may not survive. But some of them continue to adapt. Like, for example, blue rock pigeon, you don't need any human interventions for it to survive, even in cities.
Ah.
It survives on large buildings, on apartment complexes, etc.
Mm.
To that level that they have become a nuisance for people,
Mm.
leading to conflict.
Mm.
So I would say co-occurrence is a better word because there is a good we need to have an understanding that when we have conflict-prone species which are demanding resources, it can be crops, it can be livestock, it can be anything else, there'll be some certain amount of tension.
Mm.
So co-occurrence is and you'll certainly see elephants and people living together, tigers and people living together, but there is certainly a certain amount of tension in both parties. So
Mm.
I would suggest that we say co-occurrence. Some species, yes, coexistence is possible because they don't impact human lives and livelihoods. But with some species, though if they are occurring together, there's always a matter of tension and some amount of discomfort on either sides.
Okay, okay. So let's get the leopards into our conversation. So, in particular, leopards seem to occupy a strange middle ground, right? They persist even in, say, human dominated landscapes in a way tigers don't. And what does the leopard ecology teach us that the conservation of tiger science doesn't?
Yes, I mean, one important thing, after so many years of research and publishing from my work in Karnataka on leopards, though they survive in human-dominated landscapes, they have a threshold. So some of our papers clearly shows leopards start getting into huge trouble when the human density crosses about 300 people per square kilometers.
Oh.
While tigers survive in areas which have lesser human density. Perhaps they may survive up till 10 or 15 people per square kilometers. Beyond that, there's also areas which they cannot survive because of high human pressure. So
Oh.
leopards are much more resilient, but they also face a lot of problems when they survive in human dense areas, like there's die in vehicular accidents, they're poached, they get killed in snares. So there's a lot of pressure that is put on leopards, but because it is very resilient because of its body size and food requirement, it's able to survive even in areas which has high number of people practicing agriculture, practicing several other activities. Because adult male leopard weighs about 60 to 70 kgs in India,
Hmm.
and its food requirement is about 4 kg of meat every day,
Okay.
while a tiger will require about 25-30 kgs of meat every day.
Oh.
That's a huge difference.
Hmm.
So that means the leopard can survive on a small mammal like a black-naped hare, or if it kills a good-sized domestic dog, which is about 15 to 20 kgs, it can survive.
Hmm.
But a tiger cannot survive on small meat. So that's the reason why leopards are able to survive. List of species on its menu card is very varied.
Hmm.
They eat right from bandicoots to flying foxes to large prey species like sambar, which weigh about 250 kgs, while gerbil may weigh only about 100 to 120 grams. So this is the basic biology because of which leopards are able to survive in highly human dense areas.
Okay, nice. Okay, I feel now I'm closer to the leopard community in a way that I know a little about them. Let's pivot into the governance side of it, Sanjay, more into the expanding and monitoring of protected areas. So,
Yeah.
can you walk us through what actually happens after a species is understood scientifically and someone decides an area needs protection? What's the real process like bureaucratically or from, say, proposal to the final notification of it?
It's a very long drawn process. First is, you find out the areas or accidentally during your scientific work, you find out habitats which are suitable for certain species. It may need not just be for elephants or for tigers. It can also be for Indian wolves. It can be for striped hyenas.
Hmm.
It can be for does. It can be for birds. It can be for frogs. For any kind of wildlife species, if you find certain habitats suitable to be protected, and if the land is owned by the government, like a reserve forest or something, you can always propose to the government to notify them as a protected area.
Hmm.
When I say protected area under the Wildlife Act, it can be a tiger reserve, it can be a national park, it can be a wildlife sanctuary, it can be a conservation reserve, or it can be a community conserved areas. So under any of these categories, you can propose to the government to notify it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Then when I say government, you give the initial proposal to the forest department, which will send it to the government
Hmm.
through the State Board for Wildlife, which is chaired by the Honorable Chief Minister. And if once the State Board for Wildlife approves it, but they also request that it has to be discussed with local representatives and it goes through a process and endorsed by local representatives from that area. And then the proposal is sent back to the forest department for notification
Hmm.
or gazettement.
Hmm.
So if it is gazetted as a protected area, then different kind of legal approaches start to kick in.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it's a very long drawn process. You need to work right from a clerk in the government department or in the forest department
Hmm.
all the way up to the chief minister. It's not as easy and simple as I'm telling you now. It goes back and forth. There are questions raised. There will be opposition by some people. You need to address them. You need to go and talk to them, and you need to explain why it is important. And many times we don't tell them about. You may not be explaining them just from a wildlife conservation perspective. You may explain it to them to convince them from the larger ecosystem services that area would provide, how it will protect watersheds of rivers or watersheds of lakes. What a common man would generally understand, approve of. The political leader or a common man may not be interested in saving lion-tailed macaque, which is an endangered primate species from the Western Ghats. But if we tell them, look, Tunga, Bhadra, Netravati, Kaveri, all these rivers, may get protected because of this particular species, that is when they'll get more interested and they'll get more attracted towards it.
Okay, great. Okay, so there's a nice segue into whatever you've already shared. Is you've been directly involved in getting, say, a nearly million acres added to Karnataka's protected area network, which was connecting about 23 protected areas and corridors, right? So, what made that expansion possible, Sanjay? And was it primarily the science behind it, the political will, or just the timing and persistence around this whole thing?
I wish science was an important part. Unfortunately, it is not. In scenarios and places like India, I think wildlife conservation is 90% communication and 10% science. You may have a good scientific output, but if you don't market it, which most of academicians don't, there's no market to it. You can have the greatest paper in the best of the journal, but if you don't take it to common man, you don't take it to policymakers, it just ends up as another academic paper, which are thousands of which are published every day online. So your output has to be taken to policymakers, to common man, and convince them that why this area needs protection. One is that one. The second one is we need to protect whatever we currently have. Like a popular saying says, a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. So there is a lot of forest land which is available in the state or in the country which need protection. So if you upgrade the current forests, which are generally called as reserve forests or state forests, upgrade them as protected areas, nothing changes. But what comes into picture is better legal scrutiny while they divert it for developmental activities, or there is more funding available for protection against poaching or for developmental activities or so many other things. So it is a process of upgrading from a lower status to a higher status of protection. So let's say if a forest area has to be diverted to build a highway or a dam, and if it is just a reserve forest, it can be easily done by the governments or by the forest departments. But if it is made as a protected area like a national park or a wildlife sanctuary, the proposal has to first go to the forest department, which will then send it to the state board for wildlife, which is chaired by the honorable chief minister. But there are also experts and environmentalists and wildlife biologists sitting on the board who will look into the proposal and approve or disapprove. Then it has to be sent for the National Board for Wildlife, which is chaired by the Honorable Prime Minister, which also has a committee of experts which can say yes or no. And then it also goes through the scrutiny of the Honorable Supreme Court of the country. So it has much more checks and balances to divert these kind of areas for developmental activities.
Okay. So, in your experience of, say, the Bandipur one, right, the first tiger reserve in the country to get a final notification for its eco-sensitive zone, you probably indicated that through collaboration and local elected representatives and forest officials, this was made possible. So, while others might stall, like other initiatives like this might stall, was there something particularly that helped reach this phase more easily, seamlessly?
Yes, it was the involvement of some key leaders, key political leaders from that area, whom we had to convince and tell them what was the importance of eco-sensitive zone, notifying eco-sensitive zones.
Okay.
We had to convince them how important and useful it will be to agriculturists. For example, there will be no mining or quarrying within the eco-sensitive zone. There will be no commercial extraction of groundwater, for example. You can't go up and set up a soda factory there. A beverage factory within an eco-sensitive zone, which would have depleted groundwater for farmers in that area. So once we explained these kinds of advantages for common people, the political leadership was much more willing to take their own leadership into the notification process. But we were behind it and also explaining all the myths and all the wrong communications that had gone to common people about notification of eco-sensitive zones. So that was the key factor, convincing local leadership, convincing the larger audience about the advantages and disadvantages of it. But
Okay.
unfortunately, again, as in any governmental process, once it is done with a lot of good intention, it will also be misused for other purposes. For example, within an eco-sensitive zone, there is no bar on constructing houses by anybody for
Okay.
residential purposes. But because of some activism, especially misguided environmentalists, and also because of corruption issues in this country, both from not just from the government, also from the civil society side and environmentalists and other people, they have started to misuse the tool of eco-sensitive zone, where local communities are pushed to take permission just to build their own houses, which is completely against the law. The law fully permits them to construct houses for residential purposes. But this is the unfortunate thing, when a law comes into picture, when a policy comes into picture, with all the best of interest, there will be still people who want to misuse it, unfortunately.
Okay.
It can be for any law. For that matter,
Yeah.
it can be about child marriage, it could be about property registration, it can be about reducing pollution, it can be about any other law and policy. Though the intent will be good, it will all be done with the right spirits, there'll still be a small percentage of people who will misuse it.
Yeah. So it's also an interesting, aspect right now that we will move into how these voices are represented also, Sanjay. So when you say a protected area gets expanded, right, and there is always real cost to the communities nearby. So the restricted access maybe to the forest resources or grazing land or even firewood. How do you think about these trade-offs, and what does a meaningful consultation with these communities actually look like versus what happens in reality?
Meaningful consultation, yeah, I totally agree. That there should be meaningful consultations, at least with the elected representatives, because in a democratic setup, we can't deal with all the 140 crore people within the country. There'll always be agreements and disagreements within the society. We will never get a 51-49 voters, support for many of the good causes. But that is the reason in democracy, you always elect representatives. It can be right from Gram Panchayat all the way to the parliament. We have representatives whom we need to convince, because they are the ones who directly connect with the local communities or their own constituencies. So it's very important that we actually work with the elected representatives, though they may have the best of the interests or they may not have the best of the interests of the communities in many scenarios. So the true democratic setup is perhaps not even seen in any of the democracies except perhaps in Switzerland, where they have direct democracy, where they go on voting for every major policy in the country. I don't know if it will work in a country, highly populated country like India, especially with so much of dynamics of caste, religion, economics, regionalism, so many things that come into picture when you try to implement democracy. But to the best of the interest, once there are restrictions on communities, as civil societies and as government, it becomes our responsibility to also help and support the communities on providing them alternatives, because these natural resources are not infinite, they're limited resources. So the best thing is to use them in as intelligently as possible. And you all know, and I know everybody about the how common resources are utilized across the world. Eleanor Armstrong's own theory is very widely read, about the commons. So we need to have certain kind of limitations on how common resources are utilized. But whenever there is a restrictions, I totally agree, and I'm fully endorsing that alternatives have to be provided.
Okay. So, if you had to probably redesign how rural and local voices feed into conservation policy in India, and say from village to the ministry level, what's that one structural change you would like to make?
I think our structure is extraordinarily good. I know India has some of the best structures, even, for example, our local governance of the Zilla Panchayat, when the Zilla Panchayat Act came into picture. I think it has the best structure and one of the most diversified and democratic structures available. But how we utilize it is the problem within this country. It can be about waste disposable in this country. It can be the way we use water in this country. It is highly misused, despite the fact that we have all the kinds of checks and balances and the best possible.